The first days after 17 January 1945 carried a silence that did not feel like peace. When Polish and Soviet units entered Warsaw, they found not a liberated capital, but a landscape that seemed to have forgotten it was once a city at all. Walls stood without roofs. Staircases led nowhere. Whole blocks had dissolved into uneven fields of brick dust and twisted metal. Even seasoned officers described the scene as if they were walking through the shell of something that had already died. The official surveys began almost immediately, conducted by engineers and architects who had to navigate collapsed streets still smouldering from earlier fighting. Their early figures were staggering. In the central district of Śródmieście alone, reports estimated destruction between 80 and 90%. Other districts showed similar devastation. The researchers who walked those empty avenues understood that the numbers were more than statistics. They were the raw, unfiltered measure of what had to be rebuilt. Into this ruin, civilians began to return. Some had fled months earlier. Others had survived in hiding, waiting for any sign that the occupation was ending. They came back not to homes, but to the memory of them. Many found only the outlines of familiar buildings under stacks of debris. Doors opened onto the open air. Kitchens and living rooms were indistinguishable from collapsed courtyards. In the absence of intact structures, people carved out shelter in basements and cellars, often reached through narrow, unstable openings. Families huddled among broken beams and loose brickwork, burning any available scrap of wood or coal to stay warm through one of the harshest winters in memory. There were no functioning services. Wells were contaminated by rubble. Food supply lines were fragile and improvised, supported by emergency deliveries that could take days to arrive. With electricity down across most districts, the nights were lit by candles or small makeshift lamps fueled with whatever could burn. The returnees spoke of a disorienting mix of relief and despair. The war had moved on, but survival remained uncertain. Yet even in this uncertainty, a question pressed forward from every direction. What happens next? Warsaw was not a city that could simply piece itself back together. Too much was gone, too many foundations destroyed, too many streets erased. Rebuilding required more than hope. It required structure both literal and administrative. In February and March 1945, as surveys continued, the new authorities established the Bureau of Reconstruction of the capital, known by its Polish acronym BOZ. It would become one of the defining institutions of the post-war years. Led by architects, urban planners, and engineers, BOZ was tasked with deciding what Warsaw should become. Some of its members had documented the city's pre-war architecture in thorough detail. Others were innovators eager to reshape Warsaw into a model of modern urban planning. All worked under immense pressure and limited resources. Early debates within BOS carried profound consequences. Should Warsaw be rebuilt exactly as it had been? Should it embrace modern forms, wide avenues, and new housing blocks? Could the old town, nearly leveled after the 1944 uprising, be restored at all? These questions were not abstract. They touched on identity, memory, and the emotional core of a city whose past had been deliberately targeted for destruction. For the returning population, however, the immediate concerns were more basic. People needed food, warmth, water, and even a sense of safety in streets that still hid unexploded ordnance. In some places, walls threatened to collapse with the slightest vibration. The danger was so extensive that navigating one's own street could feel like moving through a fragile maze. Despite these realities, the presence of civilians carried a momentum of its own. They cleared paths through rubble to reach what remained of their homes. They rummaged through bricks to repair small sections of wall or reinforce makeshift roofs. Markets appeared in cleared patches of ground, offering necessary supplies from rural areas and nearby towns. Children explored the ruins, often unaware of the hazards beneath their feet. The rhythms of life returned in slow, uncertain steps. In this environment, BOS workers and volunteers moved through the city with notebooks and measuring tools, sketching new lines where streets had once run straight and now lay broken. They mapped the damage with the precision of medical examiners. Each collapsed block raised additional questions. Should it be restored? Should it be replaced? Should the land be cleared entirely for new designs? These were decisions that demanded both speed and vision, even as the immediate surroundings resisted stability. One challenge overshadowed all others. Warsaw lacked even the basic building materials needed to begin reconstruction. The amount of usable brick was limited. Cement and steel were low throughout the region, and transport infrastructure was in ruins. Without materials, planning could only go so far. The bureaucrats, surveyors, and citizens faced an uncomfortable truth. The city they needed to rebuild had been reduced to its own fragments, as the snow melted in early spring, revealing even more destruction beneath. The divide between necessity and possibility grew more evident. Warsaw needed to be rebuilt quickly enough to house its population, yet thoughtfully enough to reflect its heritage. The pressure was immense. Political leaders stressed the symbolic importance of restoring the capital. Architects struggled with competing visions. Ordinary families waited for decisions that would shape their daily lives. In the first months of 1945, Warsaw existed in two forms: the ruined landscape visible to anyone who walked its streets, and the imagined city being drawn on BOS drafting tables. Between these two stood a monumental challenge. The outlines of a future capital were emerging, but the foundations, both literal and figurative, were still buried beneath millions of tons of rubble. Everything depended on whether Warsaw could turn devastation into opportunity, and for that, it would need not only ideas, but raw materials that no longer existed above ground. In the months ahead, the city would look beneath its own ruins for the building blocks of its rebirth. By the summer of 1945, the scale of the destruction had become more than numbers. It was a physical presence: vast fields of broken brick, twisted shafts, and crushed concrete stretching from street to street. For many returnees, the rubble was the most dominant feature of the city. It rose in piles that could reach the height of 3-story buildings, forming ridges and valleys where avenues had once run straight. To move through Warsaw was to climb, descend, and weave through countless reminders of what had stood there only months before. Clearing these ruins became one of the earliest, largest, and most persistent tasks of reconstruction, and it began not with heavy machinery or well-funded operations, but with people, ordinary citizens who volunteered to carve paths through the wreckage. Workers' units formed from factories across Poland arrived in the capital. Students travelled by train to spend weeks hauling debris. Scouts organized teams to work alongside engineers. What they faced was monumental. Millions of cubic meters of broken material, some of it unstable, some of it fused together by heat, all of it blocking any attempt to rebuild. The work started with the simplest of tools. Shovels, wheelbarrows, and pickaxes were the main instruments in the early months. Volunteers sorted the debris as best they could. Intact bricks to one side, shattered stone to another, twisted metal to a third pile. With each cleared path, the outlines of old streets slowly re-emerged. A doorway long assumed lost might be revealed under a collapsed ceiling. A familiar shopfront might appear once heaps of ash and debris were moved aside. In these moments, the work felt as much archaeological as it did practical. Yet the task was far too massive to depend solely on manual labor. By mid-1945, BOS engineers emphasized that Warsaw needed a system, a logistical network capable of moving and processing rubble at a scale no Polish city had ever attempted. Transport routes were established using whatever remained of the tram and rail lines. Trucks and carts carried load after load to processing yards. Barges ferried debris along the Vistula, creating a riverborne conveyor belt that moved rubble toward designated sites outside the core districts. One of the most innovative strategies emerged from the city's shortage of new building materials. Engineers realized that much of the debris could be recycled. Brick fragments could be crushed and refired. Shattered concrete could be mixed to create Gruzbeton, a form of rubble-based concrete. This approach allowed the destroyed fabric of the city to become the foundation of the new one. By late 1945, small processing plants began operating on the outskirts of Warsaw. Their output would later form the walls and pavements of the rebuilt neighborhoods. But the work was far from safe. Many buildings, weakened by fire and shelling, could collapse without warning. Volunteers often wore whatever protective gear they could improvise. Scarves tied around mouths, makeshift gloves, caps pulled low against dust. Fine particles filled the air, settling on clothing and skin, making even breathing a labor. Engineers marked certain areas as too unstable to enter, yet eager hands sometimes ventured in anyway, hoping to recover personal belongings or useful materials. Injuries were common. The danger was constant. Despite the risks, the rubble-clearing efforts carried a momentum that surprised even the planners. Every cleared courtyard allowed new surveys. Every reopened street allowed transportation networks to function more effectively. By early 1946, the daily removal of rubble became a rhythm. Carts arriving at dawn, workers forming chains to pass buckets, and engineers tagging different categories of material for processing. The city's physical wounds became a shared burden, and the act of clearing them offered a rare sense of collective purpose. Still, questions loomed over the operation's pace. BOS architects had already begun drafting plans for future districts, but progress depended heavily on how quickly the land beneath the ruins could be exposed and stabilized. Some areas were cleared rapidly, revealing open spaces suitable for new housing. Others resisted every attempt at entry. In the former Ghetto district, where destruction had been absolute, the depth of debris reached several meters, making clearance a slow, grueling challenge. The sheer magnitude of the task raised broader concerns. Reports suggested that over 20 million cubic meters of rubble needed to be removed or processed. Even with volunteer enthusiasm, the work could take years, and every delay in clearing prevented the beginning of full-scale construction. Families remained in makeshift shelters longer than anyone wished. Streets that needed to be reopened stayed blocked. Water and utilities could not be restored without access to underground systems. The gap between planning and reality widened with each passing month. Yet even with these obstacles, the city's relationship with its own ruins began to shift. At first, rubble had symbolized loss, but as workers learned to sort, move, and recycle it, the rubble became something else: raw material, potential, a resource to be transformed. Piles that once marked devastation now feed processing machines. Broken stone became pavement. Crushed brick became the walls of new homes. In a way, Warsaw was building itself from its own remains. This transformation, both practical and symbolic, marked a turning point. The city had found a method to turn the overwhelming presence of destruction into the first building blocks of recovery. But while rubble could be reused, something far more complex remained unresolved. What, exactly, Warsaw was rebuilding toward? Clearing space was only the beginning. Beneath those heaps of debris lay not only the remnants of buildings, but the remnants of identity. And soon, the question of how faithfully Warsaw's past should be restored would move to the center of debate, one that would shape the very soul of the city. The first plans for Warsaw's rebirth were still being sketched when a deeper question surfaced, one that touched the very heart of the capital. In the ruins of the old town, where medieval streets had once woven together courtyards, markets, and churches, almost nothing recognizable remained. Walls lay flattened into uneven carpets of brick. The royal castle stood as a hollow carcass. The old town square, once the city's vibrant center, was a void. For many returning residents, the loss felt personal, as if an entire layer of memory had been torn away. It was here that one of the most defining debates of Warsaw's reconstruction emerged. Should the old town be rebuilt as it had been, or should it be replaced by something modern? The conversation unfolded in the offices of the Bureau of Reconstruction of the capital, where engineers, historians, and architects gathered around long tables covered with maps and faded photographs. Among them was Jan Zachwatowicz, an architect and curator whose vision would profoundly shape the city's future. Zachwatowicz believed the old town could and should be restored as a faithful reflection of its historic form. His view was not universally accepted. Some colleagues argued that recreating the past risked producing imitations rather than authentic structures. Others suggested that Warsaw needed to embrace the modern world, designing wide boulevards, efficient new housing blocks, and open squares instead of narrow medieval streets. But Zachwatowicz countered that the symbolic value of the old town outweighed the risks. Rebuilding it, he argued, was not merely an architectural act, it was a cultural one. To defend his position, he turned to paintings specifically. The 18th century cityscapes created by Bernardo Bellotto, known in Poland as Canaletto, these precise, panoramic views of Warsaw's streets and squares had been commissioned by the royal court decades before the partitions of Poland. Remarkably detailed, they captured building facades, roof lines, street widths, and even architectural decoration with unusual accuracy. As Zachwatowicz presented these works to BOS, they became visual templates for reconstruction. The paintings were hung on office walls, studied with magnifying glasses, and traced onto new architectural plans. Yet even as these images offered guidance, they also sparked controversy. Were they accurate enough to guide construction? Some critics questioned whether rebuilding from paintings created a version of Warsaw that never truly existed. Others worried that the wartime destruction would be replaced not by restored heritage, but by stylized approximations. But amid conflicting opinions, one truth held firm. Without these references, many historic buildings had no surviving records at all. Work on the old town began cautiously in 1946, starting with the perimeters of the market square. The task was daunting. Debris had to be cleared to reveal the original street levels. Foundations needed reinforcement. Surviving architectural fragments were listed and merged where possible. Teams of restorers studied surviving photographs from the interwar years, comparing them with the Canaletto paintings to identify changes in facades or historic inaccuracies. The goal was not merely to replicate the past, but to reconstruct a version of the old town that reflected its deepest cultural identity. During this period, the philosophical debate intensified. What was the meaning of authenticity in a city that had been nearly erased? Some argued that the reconstruction was itself authentic, an expression of the community's will to restore a shared past. Others insisted that modernity offered better solutions to Warsaw's housing crisis. Both sides held compelling arguments, and the tension between them shaped not only the old town, but later projects across the city. Meanwhile, the reconstruction became a topic of international interest. Architects from other parts of Europe visited Warsaw to observe the method being attempted here, noting how historical paintings were being used as architectural references. Some were skeptical, others admired the ambition. Still others feared that Warsaw risked becoming a museum rather than a living city. But to the workers clearing debris from the market square, these debates felt distant. Their task was to rebuild walls, restore doorways, and reconnect streets step by step, brick by brick. By 1947, the first actual results began to emerge. Facades along the old town square started to rise, revealing colourful outlines reminiscent of pre-war photographs. The Barbican, a 16th century defensive structure, was reconstructed using surviving fragments combined with new materials shaped according to historical drawings. Each structure required careful compromise. Where documentation was clear, restoration was precise. Where evidence was scarce, architects relied on stylistic knowledge and cautious interpretation. Yet for all its progress, the old town remained a work in progress, one that carried immense, symbolic weight. People watched its transformation closely. For many citizens, seeing recognizable shapes reappear amid the ruins offered a sense of stability. The rebuilt facades became proof that the city's past had not been entirely erased. Children who had never seen the pre-war square now grew up watching its rebirth. And though the buildings were new, they represented something older than stone: continuity. Still, not everyone accepted the project without reservation. Some critics, both inside and outside Poland, questioned whether the reconstruction amounted to creating replicas. International observers debated whether Warsaw's restored Old Town should be considered authentic heritage or post-war fabrication. These questions would resurface decades later when UNESCO assessed the site for inscription, prompting discussions about the meaning of authenticity after catastrophe. As the final segments of the market square took shape in 1948, a new realization settled over the planners and builders. The Old Town was only one part of Warsaw's vast reconstruction. Beyond its narrow streets lay districts where destruction had been total, places where even the thought of restoration raised difficult and deeply emotional questions. And soon, attention would shift to one of the most devastated areas of all: the former Ghetto, where ruins lay deeper than anywhere else, and where the very idea of rebuilding carried a weight uniquely its own. The ruins of the former Warsaw Ghetto stood apart from every other devastated district. Elsewhere in the city, fragments of walls and recognizable outlines offered at least a hint of what had once existed. Here, even those traces were gone. The destruction was so complete that early post-war surveys described the terrain not as a neighborhood, but as a massive field of rubble piled in some places several meters deep, stretching block after block without interruption. Estimates suggested as much as 6 million cubic meters of debris lay across the area. It was devastation layered upon devastation, shaped by both systematic demolition and the final fighting of 1943. To return to this terrain in 1945 was to walk across a landscape stripped of orientation. Streets no longer led anywhere. Foundations were buried under piles of brick, charred beams, and collapsed cellars. When engineers marked the site for initial assessment, they often had to rely on pre-war maps to understand which direction they were facing. The memory of the district had outlasted its physical form. The question facing the Bureau of Reconstruction of the capital was not simply how to rebuild this area, but whether it should be rebuilt as it had been at all. For many planners, the erasure of the previous urban fabric made restoration impossible. The density, the narrow courtyards, the complex grid of housing, none of it was recoverable with the evidence at hand. Others argued that recreating the district would be inappropriate, given its wartime history. By late 1945, a consensus began to emerge. This part of the city would be reimagined rather than restored. That decision shaped one of the most significant reconstruction projects of the post-war years, the creation of the Muranów district. BOS planners envisioned it as a modern, open residential area that would break with the past, both physically and symbolically. The new urban concept emphasized sunlight, air circulation, and accessible public spaces. Housing blocks would stretch along broad lines, separated by green courtyards and pedestrian paths. Wide avenues and open space would replace the tight, closed tenements of the pre-war era. To achieve this, the planners designed a completely new street grid, overlaying it on the rubble-littered landscape like a fresh start. Yet, the technical challenges were extraordinary. The rubble in Muranów was too deep to simply clear away. In some areas, the debris-filled former courtyards entirely filled, raising ground levels by multiple meters. Engineers experimented with different solutions, compressing debris to create stable foundations, redistributing materials to shape new elevations, and reinforcing sections where the ground remained unstable. Heavy machinery was brought in, but even then, progress was slow. The earth shifted unpredictably under its own weight. Basements collapsed as pressure changed. Some parts of the site had to be abandoned temporarily until safer methods could be developed. This was construction in reverse. Before building anything new, the planners had to reshape the very surface of the district. They cut channels through mounds of wreckage to form future streets. They filled deep voids with compacted debris, layer by layer. What had once been homes, workshops, and synagogues now formed the geological foundation of a future neighborhood. It was an unsettling but necessary transformation. By 1947, the first outlines of Muranów's new buildings began to rise. Simple residential blocks, built with standardized modules, offered a stark contrast to the ornate facades of the Old Town reconstruction. These structures were functional, designed to house people quickly and efficiently. The need was urgent. Across Warsaw, thousands of families waited in provisional shelters, struggling through winters in basements and improvised huts. The rapid construction of these first blocks marked a shift from clearing and planning to providing real, habitable homes. Families who moved into Muranów's earliest apartments spoke of the intense relief that followed years of uncertainty. The buildings might have lacked decorative flourishes, but they offered warmth, running water, and stability. Children played in newly created courtyards where, only a year earlier, the ground had been impassable with rubble. Shops reopened along newly paved streets. Schoolrooms were established in the first completed buildings. Slowly, daily life reclaimed a district that had seemed beyond reclamation. Yet, beneath these practical successes lay a deeper emotional tension. The new Muranów rose directly atop the destroyed ghetto, a fact impossible to ignore. Survivors and historians observed the process with a mix of understanding and unease. The planners did not conceal the past, but neither did they rebuild it. Memorialization remained minimal in these first years, overshadowed by the pressure to house a growing population. For many, the district became a symbol of Warsaw's determination to move forward. For others, it raised questions about how a city remembers when the physical landscape has been overwritten. These tensions seeped into public conversations. Some argued that the open, modern design was the only respectful response to such destruction, providing light and space in a place once marked by extreme confinement. Others believed that the absence of visible remnants risked concealing the wickedness of what had occurred. Both perspectives carried weight, and both reflected the difficulty of rebuilding in a place where no blueprint, physical or moral, existed. By 1949, Muranów had taken on a shape that no pre-war resident would have recognized. It was new in every sense, its buildings, its streets, its silhouettes. The district became a case study in how Warsaw negotiated between memory, necessity, and modernity. And its creation demonstrated that reconstruction could not simply follow a single pattern. Each part of the city demanded its own approach, informed by its own history. As the last of Muranów's early housing blocks were completed, a new force began to assert itself over Warsaw's reconstruction: political pressure. With the consolidation of communist rule and the adoption of socialist realist doctrine, architecture itself became a statement. And soon, the plans drawn in the offices of BOS would collide with the growing expectations of a new political order, one determined to shape Warsaw's image in ways that reached far beyond practicality. By 1949, Warsaw's reconstruction had entered a new phase, one no longer shaped solely by practicality, memory, or architectural debate. A political shift was underway across Poland, and the capital, as the symbolic center of the new state, became the primary canvas on which it would be expressed. Architecture was no longer just about housing and streets. It became a tool of ideology, a way to signal direction, power, and permanence. That year, the socialist realist doctrine was formally introduced into Polish architecture. Inspired by Soviet models, it called for monumental forms, symmetrical compositions, and buildings that projected strength and collective purpose. Adornment returned, not the historical details of the old town, but heavy, styled motifs meant to express socialist ideals. Wide street, open squares, processional avenues, these were the new priorities. Planners were instructed to align their work with these principles. often replacing earlier designs that had emphasized modernist efficiency or continuity with the pre-war city. For Warsaw's architects, this shift created immediate tension. Many had spent the past several years developing plans that balanced restoration with innovation. Now they were asked to reconsider those plans through a new lens. Some resisted quietly, advocating for functional housing and practical solutions. Others adapted more readily, believing the new direction offered stability and state support for major urban projects. In either case, the reality was clear. From 1949 onward, Warsaw's skyline would reflect the priorities of the emerging political order. Nowhere was this more visible than in the creation of Marszałkowska Dzielnica Mieszkaniowa (MDM). Designed as a showcase district of the new doctrine, MDM was to be a grand statement, a model neighborhood built not just for living, but for demonstration. Located along the southern stretch of Marszałkowska Street, it merged housing, commerce, and public space into one cohesive architectural expression of socialist optimism. The plans called for monumental entrances, uniform facades, and decorative details drawn from folk motifs. The new avenue would be broad, designed to house public gatherings and parades. Buildings rose in balanced sequences, each designed to complement the next. Archways connected internal courtyards. Balconies and colonnades followed rhythmic patterns. At street level, shops and cafes were envisioned to animate daily life. The district became a physical manifesto, one that could be walked, lived in, and photographed for newspapers. But beneath the impressive outlines lay the practical difficulties of construction. Poland in the late 1940s faced chronic shortages of steel, cement, and specialized labor. The six-year plan, introduced in 1950, placed heavy pressure on industrial output, but meeting even basic quotas remained a challenge. As a result, the MDM project had to balance ambition with constraints. Construction crews adapted by using simplified building methods, modular components, and whatever materials could be sourced from factories or reclaimed from earlier demolition sites. Despite these hardships, work continued at a remarkable pace. The need for housing remained urgent, and the state was determined to show rapid progress. New residents moved into completed sections, even as other parts were still being plastered or paved. Indoors, apartments tended to be modest but solid, offering gas, electricity, and well-planned space. For many families, these homes represented a dramatic improvement from the makeshift shelters of the immediate post-war years. The district's courtyards offered play areas for children. Its wide avenues encouraged gatherings and movement. Life took root quickly. Yet as MDM grew, so did the sense that Warsaw's reconstruction was no longer entirely its own. The district's carefully shaped facades and monumental scale reflected a vision imported from the East. Some residents embraced the new aesthetic, seeing in it a hopeful break from wartime devastation. Others viewed it with skepticism, feeling that it overshadowed the intimate, human-scale city that had existed before. The tension extended beyond style. It touched on questions of autonomy, memory, and identity. These debates were not simply abstract. They influenced ongoing discussions within BOS and other planning offices. Should future districts follow the example of MDM? How much should Warsaw's new architecture reflect contemporary ideological demands? Could modernist principles still be applied discreetly beneath the surface of socialist realist exteriors? Architects navigated these pressures carefully, aware that misalignment with the official doctrine could risk careers or entire projects. Amid this atmosphere, reconstruction itself remained a delicate balancing act. The urgent need for housing collided with the desire for symbolic expression. Structural sense clashed with monumental ambition. Warsaw's urban fabric became the site of negotiation between what planners believed was best for the city and what officials believed was best for the state. By 1952, as the finishing touches were put on key sections of MDM, the sense of a new Warsaw emerging grew stronger. The district had become not only a residential hub, but a visual emblem of the post-war political order. Yet even as it rose, another project began to overshadow everything else, one whose scale, symbolism, and architectural reach would surpass any district or housing block. The next stage of reconstruction would not simply reshape a neighborhood, it would redefine the skyline, dominate the horizon, and become the most controversial structure in the capital's post-war history. It was conceived as a gift, but one that carried weight far beyond its enormous size. Even before its foundations were marked, the project dominated conversations in Warsaw. Rumors spread across work sites and tram stops. A colossal building would rise in the center of the capital, a gift from the Soviet Union, offered as a symbol of friendship and socialist unity. Few knew what it would look like. Even fewer understood its scale. But as early sketches circulated among planners in 1952, one thing became clear. Nothing like it had ever been built in Poland. The Palace of Culture and Science was conceived as a towering statement, inspired by the monumental high-rises of Moscow. Its design combined classical ornamentation with the vertical thrust of modern skyscrapers. For some, it seemed a promise of progress after years of devastation. For others, a reminder of the political forces shaping the new Poland. But whatever one's view, the structure was destined to dominate Warsaw's skyline and its imagination for generations. Construction began under extraordinary conditions. Workers from the Soviet Union, many of them specialists in reinforced concrete techniques, arrived in large numbers. Reports at the time stated that around 3,500 personnel were assigned to the project, working in shifts that extended well into the night. They brought equipment unfamiliar to most local builders and introduced new practices that sped up the massive undertaking. Polish workers joined them, forming mixed crews that operated cranes, poured concrete, and assembled prefabricated components. The building's foundations required immense preparation. The ground had to be stabilized, utilities rerouted, and access roads widened. Heavy machinery moved through the city's cleared corridors, raising clouds of dust as it advanced. Every week, the steel frame climbed higher, visible from miles away. Residents who lived near the site described waking each morning to fresh progress, as if the structure were growing of its own accord. As the palace rose floor by floor, opinions multiplied. Some citizens admired the ambition of a building that promised theatres, libraries, offices, and exhibition halls all under one roof. After years defined by scarcity, the idea of such abundance felt encouraging. Others viewed the project with suspicion or resentment. They questioned why resources were being poured into a monumental tower when many Warsaw families still lived in cramped, temporary accommodations. For them, the palace was less a gift than a belief, a reminder of where decisions were being made and by whom. These conflicting emotions played out in quiet conversations across the city. Factory workers discussed the project during lunch breaks. University students debated its symbolism. Families gathering in newly rebuilt courtyards exchanged opinions as they watched the tower rise against the sky. The building became a mirror, reflecting individual hopes and frustrations amid the broader reconstruction. Inside the planning offices, logistical challenges mounted. The palace required vast quantities of steel and concrete at a time when Poland struggled to meet its construction needs. Some materials were imported, others were diverted from local projects, slowing the progress of ordinary housing blocks. Engineers raced to maintain the rapid pace set by initial directives. The building's height demanded new calculations, new safety measures, and new techniques unfamiliar to many in Warsaw's architectural community. Yet, despite the difficulties, the work never slowed. By the early months of 1955, the exterior stood nearly complete, its spire piercing the sky above the city. From a distance, it seemed almost surreal, a towering form rising from a city still dotted with open lots, rebuilding efforts, and scars of war. The palace dwarfed everything around it, altering not only the skyline but the way residents oriented themselves in space. It became a navigational landmark long before the first visitor stepped inside. In the weeks leading to its completion, crews worked to finish interior halls, install utilities, and prepare the building for public use. Marble lined the entrances. Decorative reliefs adorned its walls. Floors were polished. Offices were furnished. The structure now contained more than just architectural ambition. It housed institutions meant to project cultural and intellectual renewal. Theatres, scientific institutes, cinemas, and public meeting spaces filled its vast interior. By the time the palace opened in mid-1955, it had woven itself into Warsaw's identity in ways no earlier structure had achieved so quickly. Crowds gathered to enter its halls, curious to see what had been built with such speed and scale. Some marveled at the views from the observation deck, taking in a city still in the midst of reconstruction. Others felt unease, standing in a building that seemed to overshadow too much physically, politically, and symbolically. Across the city, the reactions remained mixed. For many, the palace offered a sense of pride, proof that Warsaw could rise again, even in unprecedented forms. For others, it was a reminder of the pressures shaping the city's evolution, pressures that reached beyond its borders. The tower's silhouette became both a symbol of progress and a symbol of influence, depending on who looked at it. But whatever one believed, the structure was impossible to ignore. It stood as a culmination of the era, a testament to ambition, power, and the complicated layers of reconstruction. And as Warsaw entered the second half of the 1950s, a question lingered in the shadow of the palace. After a decade of rebuilding, what kind of city had emerged? Was it a continuation of what had been lost, or the beginning of something entirely new? The answer would lie not in towering monuments, but in the daily rhythms of life returning to the streets still healing, yet alive once again. By 1955, a decade had passed since Warsaw emerged from the ruins. The city that now stood where devastation once stretched in every direction was neither a restored version of the past nor a completely new creation. It was something in between, an intricate blend of memory, necessity, ideology, and improvisation. To walk through Warsaw in these years was to see overlapping layers of intention: the careful restoration of the old town, the modern residential blocks of Muranów, the monumental facades of MDM, and, above all, the Palace of Culture rising like a vertical punctuation mark above the cityscape. Yet the completion of major projects did not mean the work of rebuilding was finished. In many ways, it marked the beginning of a longer reflection. What, after all, had Warsaw become? In the Old Town, the final touches were being put on the restored market square. Painters added bright colours to facades modelled on centuries-old patterns. Historians checked inscriptions. Families wandered through the newly reopened alleys, touching the smooth plaster of walls that bore the shapes, though not the original stones, of the pre-war city. For many visitors, the experience felt like reclaiming a part of Warsaw that had once seemed lost forever. Children who had grown up among rubble now saw a square filled with life, markets, and laughter. Even as restoration advanced, the debates about authenticity remained alive. Some architects insisted the old town should be viewed as a reconstructed memory rather than a faithful historical copy. Others argued that its symbolism, not its material composition, made it authentic. International observers took note. Years later, when UNESCO considered the area for its World Heritage List, the case would hinge not on the age of the buildings, but on the exceptional nature of the reconstruction, an acknowledgement that heritage can survive catastrophe through a community's will to restore it. Beyond the old town, Warsaw's new districts reflected a different kind of progress. The early housing blocks in Muranów were no longer solitary outposts on a field of rubble. They had grown into whole neighbourhoods, connected by streets and green courtyards. Residents hung laundry from balconies, bought bread from corner shops, and walked children to school along footpaths that only recently had been impassable. The district's openness and space offered relief from the density of pre-war tenements. Its design, shaped by loss, had been transformed into an everyday landscape filled with ordinary routines. In Śródmieście, the MDM project attracted new residents and daily crowds. Cafes opened under colonnades. Workers moved in and out of tram stops placed along the wide freeways. The monumental scale, once a point of debate, became woven into the city's rhythms. For some, MDM embodied a proud, modern identity. For others, it remained a reminder of the political pressures that had shaped it. But regardless of opinion, it had become part of the living fabric of Warsaw, inhabited, used, and adapted by the people it was built for. Meanwhile, the Palace of Culture and Science cast its long shadow both literally and symbolically. Standing at its base, one could feel its presence dominate the horizon, but high above, from its observation deck, the view told a different story. From that height, Warsaw was not a uniform city shaped by a single vision. It was a patchwork of reborn districts, new developments, empty lots still awaiting construction, and winding roads still aligned with pre-war maps. The palace belonged to the skyline, but the life of the city unfolded in the spaces beneath it, in courtyards, markets, tram lines, and the newly rebuilt homes that stretched outward in all directions. Population numbers told their own story. By the mid-1950s, residents of Warsaw were returning in large waves. Apartments filled quickly, new schools opened, and tram routes expanded. The city was no longer a place struggling to house its people. It had become a capital in motion again. Streets, once filled with rubble, now hum with daily life. Voices rose from open windows. Workers rushed to factories each morning. Families gathered in parks that had been cleared from ruined terrain just a few years earlier. A generation of children was growing up knowing little of the ruins their parents had once navigated. Yet even in this new vitality, certain absences remained. Some streets had been erased forever. Some districts had been replaced entirely. Some landmarks would never return. And beneath the rebuilt surfaces lay the emotional strata of a city marked by destruction, resistance, and recovery. Warsaw's reconstruction had been driven by urgency, politics, and vision, but also by the quiet determination of its inhabitants, those who cleared rubble, carried bricks, drafted plans, and believed that a capital could rise again, even when scarcely a stone was left standing. The legacy of these years lay not only in architecture, but in the choices made about what to preserve, what to rebuild, and what to let go. Warsaw did not emerge from the 1950s as the city it had once been. Instead, it emerged as a city rebuilt from memory, shaped by modern needs, and transformed by forces far larger than any single blueprint. As the decade closed, visitors standing in the Old Town Square could look south toward the modern avenues, then further still toward the towering palace, and see the layers of a city that had been shattered and reassembled. Each district told a different story. Together, they formed one narrative of resilience, complexity, and compromise. And so the question lingered: when a city rebuilds, after near total destruction, what does it choose to rescue? Stones, silhouettes, stories, identities, hopes. Warsaw had tried to rescue all of them, and in doing so, it had created not only a restored capital, but a living testament to what reconstruction means when everything must begin again. The work of rebuilding was no longer defined by rubble or shortages, but by the ongoing task of shaping a future from a past almost lost. The city now lived with its history, its achievements, and its contradictions reborn, yet forever marked by the journey that brought it back. If stories of cities rebuilt from ruin resonate with you, consider staying with us for more journeys through history's aftermaths.